Schönen guten Nachmittag nach Österreich. Good morning to our speakers in Canada. Herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Gregor Postel, ich bin der österreichische Wirtschaftsdelegierte in Toronto und ich freue mich heute, Sie zu unserer Webinarserie Lebensmittel und alkoholfreie Getränke erfolgreich nach Kanada zu exportieren zu begrüßen. Ja, heute haben wir unsere letzte Serie, nämlich Teil Nummer 4. Hier besprechen wir regulatorische Richtlinien und vor allem ist der Fokus auf Lizenzen und Mustersendungen. Bevor wir mit dem Webinar starten und ich zu den Sprechern weitergebe, noch ein paar Housekeeping-Regelungen. Das Webinar wird aufgezeichnet, das heißt, sind Sie später eingestiegen oder müssen Sie früher weg? Sie bekommen in ein paar Tagen einen Link zu dieser Aufzeichnung und natürlich auch die Vortragsunterlagen. Wir bitten Sie daher eben, das Mikrofon umzuschalten und auch die Kamera auszuschalten. Haben Sie technische Probleme, dann bitte schreiben Sie in den Chat. Wir werden uns bei Ihnen melden, aber aus Datenschutzgründen bitte schreiben Sie nicht Ihre Telefonnummer rein. Wir wissen schon, wie wir Sie kontaktieren können. Und nützen Sie den Chat natürlich auch für Fragen. Wir haben ja dann wieder traditionell am Ende unseres Webinars eine Question-Answer-Session und wir würden uns freuen, da auf aktuelle Fragen von Ihnen eingehen zu können. Ich darf einmal zur Agenda übergehen. Es gibt eine kurze Einleitung, da werde ich Ihnen unsere heutigen Sprecher vorstellen. Danach werden dann die Expertinnen und Experten ihre Präsentation machen und wie schon angekündigt, zum Schluss unsere Question-Answer-Session. Bevor ich mit der Einleitung anfange, möchte ich noch mal darauf hinweisen, dieses Webinar ist eine Kooperation und eine Initiative von Go International. Das ist eine gemeinsame Initiative vom Bundesministerium für Arbeit und Wirtschaft und der Wirtschaftskammer Österreich, die uns ermöglicht, Sie über solche Informationen immer aktuell zu halten. Ja, ich darf Ihnen nun die Expertinnen und Experten vorstellen. Wir haben Leanne Lutomsky, Erwin Darabarelli und Robert Cowie. Zunächst zur Leanne Lutomsky. Sie ist Director von Client Optimization bei Source Nutraceutical. Sie hat eine umfangreiche Erfahrung in Regulierungen und Management, ist verantwortlich auch für kontinuierliche Verbesserung der internen und externen Geschäfte und Prozesse und hat schon sehr viel Arbeitserfahrung. Noch mehr Arbeitserfahrung hat Erwin Darabarelli. Einige von Ihnen werden sie schon kennen. Sie hat auch bei den vorigen Webinaren bereits als Sprecherin teilgenommen. Sie ist Director of Regulatory Affairs bei Source Nutraceutical, hat über 20 Jahre Berufserfahrung im Bereich Regulierung in den US-amerikanischen und kanadischen Märkten und kann sie unterstützt viele Firmen bei komplexen regulatorischen Herausforderungen und natürlich bei der Expansion in neue Märkte. Wir haben dann noch einen, ich würde fast sagen, Haudegen, nämlich Bob Cowie, unseren Vice President der Regulatory Affairs bei GHY. Warum alter Haudegen? Er hat über 50 Jahre Berufserfahrung, ist ein erfahrener Experte für Bekleidung und Textilhandel in Kanada, ist aber sozusagen ein Zollprofi und hilft bei der Zusammenarbeit mit kanadischen und US-amerikanischen Zollbehörden, kann Kunden unterstützen bei Prozessoptimierung und bei Vereinfachung der Zollvorschriften. Er hat ein extrem hohes Fachwissen. Ich glaube, hohe Motivation brauche ich nicht sagen, wenn jemand schon über 50 Jahre arbeitet und immer noch sozusagen die Leidenschaft hat, Firmen und Kunden zu beraten, was Zollprobleme betrifft und effektive Ansätze zu Problemlösungen anbieten kann. I now once again switch in English, because now we will start with our speakers, with our experts. And I now would like to ask Erwin to kick off the speakers session, and the floor is yours. And I will ask you to switch on your camera, your microphone, and share the screen with your presentation.
Okay, thank you again. Thanks again to Advantage Austria for inviting us to speak today on Canadian regulations, this time on food imports from a food safety perspective. My name is Erin Taraborelli, and I am the Director of Regulatory Affairs at SNI. A little disclaimer first, this presentation media is educational in nature and is not intended for broad public distribution. The technical content contained in this presentation is current as of its date of presentation and is presented for information purposes only. It is not intended to be, nor should be construed as legal advice. So today we're going to be talking about importing food from Austria to Canada, licensing requirements under the Safe Food for Canadians Act and regulations, preventive control plans for food importers, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions at the end of Bob's presentation. First, we're going to start with a general overview of requirements for importing food from Austria to Canada. In my last presentation, I mentioned the Safe Food for Canadians regulations. These are brand new, and they require all importers to have an SFCR license. In most situations, you will need to export to Canada through a licensed Canadian importer unless you qualify as a non-resident importer. And a non-resident importer is an importing business located outside of Canada that ships goods to customers in Canada and assumes responsibility for customs clearance and other import requirements. An NRI does not have a physical domestic address in Canada, and they are allowed to obtain a Safe Food for Canadians license under certain conditions, depending on the country they are located in and the type of food they are looking to bring into Canada. Generally, this tends to benefit companies in the US primarily and only minimally otherwise. Austria is one of the EU member states with approved meat systems and meat products, and NRIs in Austria are able to import raw bovine, raw swine, and raw poultry as long as there is a traces certificate from the EU, and processed swine and poultry broth, flavors, and extracts with a bilateral official meat inspection certificate. Unfortunately, no other foods or beverages are allowed to be imported to Canada from Austria by an NRI. They would need to work with a licensed Canadian importer. However, there are other requirements the importer would need to ensure are met. Generally, food products are subject to very strict import controls in Canada. However, there are some exemptions for small amounts of product intended only for sampling or other free distribution during a trade show, exhibition, or similar event. Required permissions and permits are coordinated through CFIA's, which is Canadian Food Inspection Agency's, National Centre of Permissions. If you have questions about that process, you can contact an import coordinator at the CFIA area office closest to the event that you are planning on attending. Any required permit or authorization should be obtained as early as possible before the planned import. For example, at least 6 weeks prior to the event. In some cases, it might be best to work with an import broker to assist with the arrangements. Note, all documentation must be in English or French, and products that are new to the Canadian market will require a product assessment before, so information should be submitted at least a few weeks before, earlier than necessary. And high-risk products, for example, dairy products for event use, may either be imported under the same animal import-export requirements as a typical commercial shipment or with an animal health import permit. You and/or your importer or legal representative are responsible for the safety of all the products that are offered for sampling at these exhibits. Health and safety inspections may be conducted anytime by the CFIA, with unsafe products returned to the place of origin or destroyed at the importer's expense. And changes to these requirements for the regulations may occur at any time due to regulatory changes in your own country or in Canada. And you should reconfirm that you have met all of the current requirements prior to shipping all the products. Now, what is a small amount of product? The following two tables in the next two slides show the conditions required for an exemption for that Safe Food for Canadians licensing for importing food samples. So licensing is not required for aquatic animals if the amount imported is less than 100 kilograms, dairy products, the same, eggs, shell eggs, if the amount imported is less than 5 cases of 30 dozen per case, processed eggs less than 100 or less than or equal to 100 kilograms, meat products is the same. And note each of these commodities, even if excluded from the actual licensing requirements, still has specific food safety requirements that must be met depending on that product type. Licensing is also not required for other manufactured food if the amount imported is less than 100 kilograms. Alcoholic beverages fall into an exemption because they're actually conducted by provincial and territorial liquor control boards, not federally. Food additives in any amount, plant and plant products if the amount imported is less than 100 kilograms. And again, each of these commodities do have specific requirements that must be met, even if the licensing is not needed. Canadian companies or non-resident importers not otherwise exempted from Safe Food for Canadians licensing must fulfill a number of requirements to attain that importing license. These requirements may not be required of you if you are working through a Canadian importer, but you should be aware of the requirements the importer has and why they may be requesting the information that they do. In order to obtain a Safe Food for Canadians importing license, the importer must have the following documented and implemented systems: traceability, recall, customer complaints, and a preventive control plan. And we're going to look a little bit closer at each of these programs in the next few slides. Traceability programs are documented instructions to ensure the importer's ability to track the movement of a food or a food commodity. They must identify the food with the common name, the name and address of the company, and a lot code to trace the food. You must be able to trace the food one step back to the person that provided you with the food, including the date on which the food was provided to you. And you must trace the food one step forward to the person you provided the food to, including the date on which you provided the food. And next is recall. So recall programs are written procedures designed to be able to effectively mitigate any risk to public health through the effective removal of the food from further sale at any point in the supply chain. So typical recall reasons may be incorrect labeling, for example, undeclared allergens, or bacterial contamination, for example, listeria, or chemical contamination, for example, arsenic. And a documented recall program is required in order to have that importing license. Customer complaint programs are also required. These are written procedures to ensure that all customer complaints are received, tracked, investigated, and resolved in a timely manner. This will often include an investigation into the complaint, a risk assessment, a root cause analysis, what caused the issue, and preventative control plans to prevent the occurrence of the issue. Customer complaint programs will also track food safety and quality issues to determine if there are any trends happening. If the investigation determines that the affected product presents a risk of injury to a human health, a recall may be required and the CFIA would be notified. Our last topic will cover the general requirements for what is needed in an import preventative control plan, because this can be pretty exhausting to do. An import preventative control plan, also known as IPCP, is a written set of procedures to ensure that the food is being imported meets all of the requirements of the Safe Food for Canadians Acts and regulation. This includes assessing foreign suppliers and their facilities, assessing each food product to determine inherent hazards that type of product may have, ensuring that there are control measures implemented for each hazard identified and monitoring those, and verifying that the control measures are effective, and then reassessing the IPCP as needed. It's important to ensure that the products being imported meet Canadian ingredient and labeling regulations as well. Each foreign supplier must be assessed to ensure that they meet the relevant requirements. Assessment takes place before the import of food and covers criteria such as the interior and exterior of the building, equipment, sanitation, pest control, chemicals, water, steam and ice, employee practices, hygiene, housekeeping, good manufacturing practices, and the processes and procedures to ensure safe food. Note that these assessments are determined by risk, and locations that have certification to a global food safety or the GFSI benchmarked audit standard, such as SQF, for example, will typically meet all of these requirements and won't require further assessment. Locations without the GFSI certification may require third-party audits or customer audits. Supplier assurances ensure HACCP aspects are in place. Hazard identification and evaluation, they must have determined all biological, chemical, and physical hazards that could pose a risk to the food and how those hazards have been controlled. The description of control measures, the foreign supplier must describe each control measure, including the tasks that need to be carried out, the frequency of those tasks, and the person responsible. Critical control points have been identified. The foreign supplier must list each process step where a significant hazard has been identified. Verification of control measures. The foreign supplier has verification procedures that ensure their control measures are consistently implemented and effective at controlling that hazard. And then the implementation of the food safety plan. The foreign supplier must keep documentation that demonstrates the food safety plan has been implemented. The Safe Food for Canadians regulations requires that imported foods are subject to the same level of hazard analysis and preventive control safety controls, food safety controls, as food that is produced in Canada. For each food product that is imported, the importer is responsible to ensure that all biological, chemical, and physical hazards that may be reasonably expected to contaminate the food have been identified and described. This includes both the hazards that are inherent in the food and hazards that are known to be caused by the foreign supplier's processes and procedures. So an example of this would be the presence of patulin, a mycotoxin in apple juice. So we have identified a potential hazard here. There must be evidence that there are control measures in place that are effective in controlling all the hazards that have been identified with the foods that have been imported. Hazards that are identified in the imported foods are either controlled by the foreign supplier at the time of manufacture, or the importer may have responsibility to control the hazards if they are not controlled by the supplier. So continuing the example from before, this would include confirming that the apple juice that we were talking about is being tested to ensure the levels of the patulin toxin are below 50 parts per billion. And the importer is responsible for ensuring that these controls are effective in mitigating the hazards that are identified. Verification can be done either internally or through the hiring of a qualified company to conduct the verification activities. So again, continuing the example from before, this could include a review of certificates of analysis from the supplier showing that the lot of apple juice does in fact have a patulin content below 50 parts per billion. The import PCP must be maintained to ensure that it remains relevant to the products and up to date with any changes that arise. The import PCP would be reassessed at a predetermined frequency if there are changes to products or suppliers, or if there are issues that arise, such as a trend in customer complaints. As an example, a reassessment may be triggered if a new supplier is going to be onboarded to replace an existing supplier, or if a new product is going to be imported. Using our apple juice example, possibly a new supplier needs to be brought in that does not have a GFSI certification, or the apple juice is being swapped for a different type of juice. The IPCP may need to be updated based on this new information. Products that are imported into Canada must meet the requirements set out in all regulations, as well as the applicable consumer protection provisions. An example is compliant Canadian labeling, including allergen declaration, additive usage, standards of identity, and class and size designations, all which likely differ from the regulations in the originating country. These requirements are typically met through in-depth reviews of label compliance. It is the importer's responsibility to ensure that those products that are imported meet all of these requirements, and a third-party provider can be used to provide this assurance. That brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. I just want to say navigating the Canadian regulations is definitely a challenge, but our team is here to help with our 3 unique divisions and services tailored to your needs. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin, very much. It was a very interesting presentation, very precise. Once again, to the audience, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to type it in the chat function so that we have some meat to discuss during our question and answer session. But now let me give the floor to our next expert, Bob Cowie. And please, Bob, the floor is yours. Share your screen, unmute yourself, and switch on your camera.
So hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be asked to be able to present at the Austrian webinar series for food and beverage companies. So good morning to you all in Canada, and good afternoon to all of you in Austria. So just a little bit about who we are. GHY is a Canadian and US customs broker and trade consulting company. So we've been around in Canada since 1901. We're headquartered here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, with branch offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary. And in 1995, we opened up our GHY US brokerage company. We're headquartered in Pembina, North Dakota, which is about 96 kilometers south of Winnipeg. And just in the last couple of years have opened up in Columbia, South Carolina to service some of our US customers. So if you attended the March 11th webinar that Christian Sevier had presented with Solomix, and he spoke about the CETA agreement, which Canada and the European Union solidified and took effect on September 21st, 2017. And he touched on the steps necessary to get the benefits of duty-free entry and Canada's import, customs and food regulations. So I'm going to talk about some of the specific import requirements, focusing on some of the common issues and questions as posed by international companies wanting to do business in Canada. So one of the first questions we're asked by international companies wanting to do business in Canada is, look, we want to do business in Canada, but how do we get our samples to our potential customers? And Erin touched a little bit on this in her presentation as well. Food products are subject to strict import controls in Canada. And however, there are some exemptions for small amounts of product intended only for sampling or other free distribution during a trade show or exhibition. So I've got a slide here that I can share with you and call up here. I'm going to click on this. And you will have this as part of the presentation. It's just a guide for importing food and plant products for trade shows into Canada. I'm going to focus on some of the basic guidelines, and Erin also talked about this. Plan as early as possible. If you've got products such as dairy products, cheese, milk, meat products that are subject to possible quota or import permits, it's suggested that at least 6 weeks prior to the event, you send information to Canada. I'll click on some of the basic guidelines here. want to talk a little bit about food licenses. Aaron touched base on that, but this slide will help you with some of the questions you may have. Talks about who needs a food license. If I click on that, it'll also talk about some of the exemptions, typically food that is carried on a conveyance intended for crew or passengers, and food that is imported in bond. So there's all kinds of general exceptions here. And one of the things that I kind of will go back to this is to touch on some of the basic guidelines. So I believe also in the last webinar, one of the things that Christian talked about was there were a lot of questions related to the imports of meat. Aaron touched on this as well. So when I go in here, I'm going to click down here to meat products, and it talks about some of the requirements. For samples, no licenses required. Here's your quantities, 100 kgs or less. And for some of the health or animal requirements for other countries, 100 kgs or less of any meat product. And there are some information here, but this is a handy screen for you to be able to look at with regards to those types of samples. So now you're back from your trade show and you're wanting to do business in Canada. You say, you know what, we've got some potential customers. We've already got some customers that want to do business with us. So the next step is to strategize on how you want to do business in Canada. Non-resident importers are allowed to get a food license under certain requirements, as Aaron had also indicated. A little bit more difficult, but there is that ability. So you might want to operate as a non-resident importer where you don't have a physical presence in Canada, but you're going to sell the product to your customers and you're going to look after all of the customs clearance and any customer, and the customer has no worries. One of the things that we find with many companies when they first start doing business in Canada is they work through a distributor. A lot of companies in Canada, that's what they do. They distribute your products and they most likely have their own food license. So you may want to do that to begin with. Or in some cases, they're saying, look, our product, people want to get it. We know that it's allowed, it's labeled properly and all that other type of stuff. We may want to have our customers look after their own customs clearance. Again, there's a neat little guide here that you can talk on, and it talks about all the steps you need to do before your import. I like this one here, know your food, what are some of the risks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a handy guide to go through when you're going down those steps to start doing business in Canada. So specific items such as milk, cheese, margarine, yogurt, and ice cream fall under the regulatory purview of the Export and Import Controls Global Affairs in Canada is what we're called. So they're subject to tariff rate quotas, necessitating a permit to leverage the advantages. So the fact that, Christian talked a little bit in his presentation as well about these certain types of products. And the one thing that I can tell you is that when you're importing products such as cheese, and there are quotas involved, it doesn't mean that you can't import it, but in order to import cheese and receive the benefits of the free trade agreement, you have to have an import permit. But if you cannot get one, and it may be just samples, it may be just the cost of doing business, you could import cheese. And in the case of cheese, you're going to pay 245.5% duty. But I've got some frequently answered questions here that you'll be able to look at. You'll notice it says CETA and the Canada-UK agreement as part of the European Free Trade Agreement. As you all may know, the UK dropped out, but because they're also, have a lot of products coming into Canada, Canada has a separate agreement with them. If I click on this, and you guys can all see this when you get the presentation, just some frequently asked questions with regards to import and export origin controls, what are quotas and those types of things. The other thing here is something that you may find very interesting is the utilization data on cheese. So every day Global Affairs publish the available quantities that are left with regards, in this case, to cheese. So you'll see that the negotiated level of 16 million kilograms of cheese of all types. and another separate category, 1.7 million kilograms for industrial cheeses that are used for food processors. So every day you'll see that this one here, as of March 26th today, you'll see that these are the types of cheese, and it tells you the types of percentages that have been, or the kilograms that have been imported for all of these on a daily basis. So if you're wanting to get your cheese into Canada and you want to know how much is left, it's a handy site to be able to look at. The next one here is your CETA origin utilization. So this is another site that Global Affairs had. So it's kind of the reverse. If you're looking to buy goods from Canada, it gives you an example of the exports out of Canada going to Europe. And I find it really interesting. You'll notice here that there's hardly any goods that are shipped from Canada to Europe. You've got your dog and cat food. You'll see that nothing's been utilized yet. Same as your CETA processed food, your sugar confectionery. The only real business that we have is the apparel industry. So we've got a lot of exports of textile apparel and imports of textile apparel that we do back and forth, and it gives you the negotiated levels and the available balances. Find that kind of interesting. This next one here is your CETA cheese quota holders list, something where these could be your potential customers in Canada that may have, you know, already available quota. And, you know, if you're importing a product that's subject to quotas, you might be able to contact them and say, hey, look, you know, you want to get our products, you know, sell products of cheese, you may want to be able to use your quota to bring our Austrian cheese into Canada. Not only that, is there is the ability that you may want to be in touch with some of these companies, and near the end of the year, they might say, you know what, we're not having a really good year and we've got this quota, and they may want to transfer some to you. The way the rules in Canada are for cheese, if they give you quota based on your past history, if you don't use it, you lose it. So a lot of these companies are trying to scramble to make sure that they can make sure they get the same quantity in the next year. We've got also here some frequently asked questions with regards to the frequently asked questions regarding CETA cheese. Some interesting things. How can I apply for an allocation to get my own cheese quota? And all these other types of things. So these are things that you can look at when you do get the presentation shared. So one thing required in all cases is to research and ensure that you have the correct classification for your products. So all of your other government department, CFIA, Health Canada, for instance, all of the requirements that they need are based on the tariff classification of the product. So it's the same thing with your rules of origin. In this example of apricot jam, there are no quota restrictions. And the initial step is to understand the Canadian Food Inspection requirements. So you need to have the product classified. The one thing that you may or may not know is that under the World Trade Organization, all countries should have the same tariff classification to the first 6 digits. So in this case here, apricot jam is classified under the provisions of tariff 2007.99. And if it meets the criteria for the free trade agreement, the rule of origin, it's going to be duty free. In other words, it incurs a duty rate of 8.5%. And again, additionally, obtaining a safe food for Canadians license is mandatory for approval of a product. And here's where I'm going to test you guys to see how good my Austrian is. So I had looked at some of the products that are common and big sellers in Austria, and I noticed that one of the processed meat products is a product called Tyrol Karaspeck. How did I do there? Anyone want to answer that? Did I pronounce that right? I think you might all be on mute. So you can answer that at the very end. But Christian talked about this AIRS tool that's available. And what the AIRS tool is, I'm just going to scroll down here to, there we go. The AIRS tool stands for the Automated Import Reference System. So this is going to be something handy that you should all probably have if you're trying to get your product into Canada, just to find out what the other government requirements are. In other words, can I bring it in? And if so, what do I need? So I'm going to walk you through an example here for this product. So in Canada, the product is known as Austrian smoked and dried cured pork loin. And the first thing to do is to classify it. And I notice here that there's an error on this slide. It should be tariff classification 1602. I had it corrected, but for some reason I must have pulled up the wrong slide here. So the tariff should be 1602.49. So I'm going to go into the Automated Import Reference System here, and we'll walk through it together. So here is the AIRS requirement, and it gives you, you can do search by name, but I think one of the handy things is I go and I look at the HS code. So I know that the chapter for this is 1602. So I'm going to click on chapter 16 and I'm going to push go. And then I'm going to look at the next prompt when I do the down arrow here. So it's other prepared or preserved meat. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to push go. Then I'm going to go into the screen again and it's going to say, well, what type of product is it? I'm assuming, it may be ham and cuts, it may be shoulders, but I wasn't quite sure. So I'm just going to put other of swine and I'm going to push go there. I'm going to go into the next thing and it's going to talk pork. It definitely is pork. And I'm going to say that it's hermetically sealed when you're going to be sending it to Canada. I'm going to push go there. I know that it's going to be luncheon meat because that's what it is. I'm going to push go. I'm going to look at the next screen. It's going to say it's coming from Europe. So I'm going to push go. In this particular case, I'm going to push Austria. I'm going to push go. And then I'm going to look at the next one. I'm going to say it's for human consumption. I'm going to push go. And I'm going to assume that it's going to be fully marked. I'm going to push go. And then it talks about the types of requirements that are needed to be able to get the product into Canada. So you need a meat inspection certificate. You need to have an export establishment, et cetera, et cetera. So that is that particular product. And the next one that I'm going to talk about is a product, non-alcoholic wine. And I know Aaron touched on it, as did Christian in the last presentation. And they talked about Canada is a funny country because if it's alcoholic products, it's provincially regulated opposed to federally regulated. So we've got 10 provinces in Canada. So it's sort of like dealing with 10 different countries. If you got product going in Ontario, you need to deal with the Ontario Liquor Board. If you had products coming into Manitoba, you deal with the Manitoba Liquor Commission. So this particular example is non-alcoholic wine. But one of the things I wanted to mention here is that very important to make sure that when you're sending product into Canada that you have a very good description. I know that one of the things that, when I was introduced to Christiane and the people in, at Austria Advent in Toronto, they had said to me that, one of the things I want you to somewhat touch base on is why are some of these products sometimes delayed in customs? And a good example of if the description just basically said wine and nothing about non-alcoholic wine, you could get tied up and you'd have to deal with the provinces, and then you'd find out it's non-alcoholic wine. Say, well, you know what, if it's non-alcoholic wine, it would be able to be cleared, just through your customs broker. It's a federal requirement. So the definition of non-alcoholic sparkling wine is a alcohol content not exceeding 0.5% by volume. And if that is the case, it can be imported. If it meets the rule of origin for the CETA agreement, it would be duty-free. And if not, you could still import it. It would be dutiable at 3.3 cents per liter. This is an interesting one. So when I sent this screen or presentation over to Christiana, she says, did you perhaps miss something on that screen? And the answer was no. It it's going to be a little story time, a little bit true story about a product that is going to be talking about the particular product, but it's also going to be talking a little bit about the free trade agreements. We have a free trade agreement with CETA, but there are a lot of other free trade agreements that Canada has. So something, you know, if you're getting your products into Canada and everything's working fine, you may also have products that, you know, could be coming from other countries. And if Canada has a free trade agreement with that country, there could be some benefits and there's a direct shipment requirement, etc. But currently, Canada has a total of 15 free trade agreements covering 51 countries. And that accounts for 61% of world GDP. So some countries have factories in different parts of the world, and should a particular product be manufactured in multiple factories, there may be the ability to take advantage of a free trade rate of duty. So we had an example years ago on an energy drink that was coming into Canada. And one of the things that I noticed is that the particular company had multiple factories throughout the world. And back in 2009, 2010, all the way up to 2017, before we had the CETA agreement, Canada did have a free trade agreement with 4 European countries. It was called the Canadian and Canada and European Union free trade agreement. And the 4 countries were Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein. So in this particular case, the company in Europe had a factory in Switzerland, and they moved the production from a European country that didn't have a free trade agreement to Switzerland, immediately realized, and I think it was in year 1 and 2, $9 million in savings. So that's just an example of something to be aware of is when you're importing products, is that there may be the ability with different factories that you may be able to perhaps take advantage. So be aware that Canada has free trade agreements with other countries and may end up helping you. And that's the end of our presentation here. I do have one other slide, which is something happening in Canada. It's going to take up way too much time, but it's going to be important for especially non-resident importers. It's called CARM. I've got a slide on this. I can answer some questions, but there's some interesting information you can click on here and just some testimonials that we have. And that is it for our presentation. There's my name, I'm Vice President of Regulatory Affairs here at GHY, and I'm done.
So I have already one question for Bob, because we saw North America is a very important market for Austrian food companies. And there was a question because for one Austrians, Canada is the entry point for US, and for other, US is the entry point for Canada. But for example, we have Austrian companies exporting food products to Canada and then subsequently to US market. So in case there is a duty applied and have been paid to the goods that were imported into Canada, can they be recovered or not?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. And it's interesting, that gateway. So one of the things that happens is in the United States, shipments less than $800 in Canada, or $800 in value, can enter the US market in many cases duty-free. They're talking about changes happening. So a lot of companies will import the products into Canada first, pay the duty, and then when they export it, they can recover those Canadian duties. So the answer is yes. You've got to have good record keeping to make sure that you can provide proof of export, but the answer is yes.
Okay, I have another question for Leanne and Aaron. And Aaron, by the way, your camera is not switched on, so I think you are not shy because you made a presentation. So please kindly ask you.
It shows on for me. I'm sorry. I turned it off and on again. Is it still not working?
We still don't see you, but at least we hear you, so we know you.
Okay, I'm
You are
sorry. It shows
present.
on for me. I'm not sure
So
what to do.
at least we saw you we know your face. So maybe it's for Aaron or for Leanne. So there was a question. You were talking about keeping up with changing regulations. So you can import samples, but you have always to look on the regulations. So what can you do? How can you keep up with all the regulations? Because sometimes you start prepare to send food samples to Canada, but how is there a possibility that you can keep up with the regulation? What is the best way?
Yeah, I can answer that one. There are always changing regulations that could be to do with, sampling and quantities allowed. It could be to do with labeling or even just formulation acceptance. There's new food additives all the time being added to the acceptable list. So one of the ways that we keep up, just as a consulting company, is the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, or CFIA, does have a great website. They do have a lot of guidance available on importing, licensing, foreign establishment verification, many other things like labeling, like I said, all the kind of requirements for food products in Canada. They have a way to subscribe to email notifications as well through the CFIA. At the bottom of their main page, you can subscribe and just make sure that you do get email notifications for different topics that you're interested in. We also, of course, try to do our best to keep up with the changing regulations and advise our clients as well. We have, at SNI, we have a LinkedIn page. We definitely post updates on all those regulated industries, foods, even natural health products, cosmetics, non-prescription drugs, medical devices, just making sure that we stay on top and can help our clients also stay up to date.
Perfect. I have another question also to SNI. We were talking about the non-resident importers. And so there is a question that someone wants to import pastries to Canada directly from Austria, but doesn't have a physical address in Canada. I think the person can do it or not. I think with a importer or a customs broker or distributor, it's possible. Huh?
Yeah, so I can take that one, even though you can't see me.
Now we can see you. Now we can see you.
Oh, you can see me?
Yeah.
Strange.
Perfect.
Okay. So unfortunately, no, without a domestic Canadian address, it would be considered a non-resident importer, and those non-resident importers that are located in Austria would only be limited to importing those meat products that I mentioned in the presentation. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, no, it tends to benefit US companies more, but that doesn't mean that they can't be imported. Of course, they just need to work with a licensed Canadian importer to do that.
So it must be a licensed Canadian importer, otherwise it's just for meat, and it's only meat and nothing else.
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, exactly.
Okay, then I have another question for Bob. Because sometimes we are always confronted with questions from Austrian companies regularly that, so can you tell us what is the recommended best practice for manufacturers when determining that the declared value of samples on the invoice being shipped to the potential partners? Because sometimes they ask me, what value should I put on the invoice? Do you have some suggestions, some recommendations?
Yeah, that's a great question. We see a lot of products come into Canada. Sometimes it just says no charge. There has to be a value, and for customs purposes, it typically would be your cost, which would be, you take your bill of materials and you look at your cost. That is one of the things that a lot of people should be doing. Sometimes we see things like $5. So you're looking at a particular item and they're saying, well, there's no way that this is worth $5. So the value that should be used would either be the value that is your cost, if you take your bill of materials, or the value that you would sell it for when you do get applicable sales. It really makes a lot of sense in Canada. Although we have a goods and services tax, most food products are exempt. of paying that. It's 0 rated. And and if the goods meet the terms of the free trade agreement, they're going to be duty free anyway. So we a lot of times tell our people that, if the product's going to be duty free, there's no GST, just to avoid any inquiries by customs. Show the price you would be selling it for if you ever want to get that product into Canada.
I have another question. I don't know to whom I address it, but there's a question. Are there any specific regulations or guidelines regarding sugar content of products? Who can answer me this question?
I can answer that. Sure. So specifically the content, not necessarily. There's no restriction on how much sugar can be in a particular product. I'm assuming we're talking about conventional foods here. But there are very strict regulations about the labeling of sugars. So sugars have to be declared in the nutrition facts table, and also the different types of sugars. So sugar-based ingredients, which can be obvious sources of sugars like sugar, but also honey, agave syrup, maple syrup, or concentrated fruit juices have to be listed together under the heading sugars in the ingredient list, and then put in the descending order by weight of that new combination. So that's to show consumers how much sugar they're actually going to ingest by consuming that product.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we are now more or less at the end of our time, and I see that already there are no any more questions coming. So I would like once again to share the screen. So I want once again thank all the speakers for their lively input, especially Aaron, who was not only one but several times in our webinar series. Also thanks to Leanne, and of course to Bob, who can look back at a very long working experience. Maybe just allow me to switch once again to German and make some announcements for future webinars and future projects, just 1 or 2 minutes. Ja, ich möchte Ihnen sagen, Fortsetzung folgt. Das war zwar jetzt eine 4-teilige Webinarserie, die wir jetzt durchgeführt haben, aber wir haben uns schon weitere Punkte überlegt, und wir bitten Sie, am Ball zu bleiben. Wir wollen auch noch zu weiteren Aspekten im Bereich Import von Lebensmitteln und Getränken von Österreich nach Kanada zusätzliche Webinare anbieten, die vielleicht sogar nicht 1 Stunde dauern, vielleicht nur ganz kurz sind, nur einen Sprecher haben, aber die ganz konzentriert auf bestimmte Einzelheiten eingehen. Also stay tuned, bitte bleiben Sie dran. Dann noch 2 kurze Sachen, weil es auch mitunter für Lebensmittelexporteure nach Kanada interessant sein kann. Wir haben am 4. April ein Webinar zum Thema E-Commerce in Kanada. Das heißt, wie bringe ich Produkte hinein? Wir betrachten hier die rechtlichen Aspekte, die steuerlichen Aspekte, aber eben auch Logistik ist sehr, sehr wichtig, und wir haben auch eine Firma mit Best Practice, die Ihnen erzählen kann, wie schaut es so aus, wenn man Produkte über E-Commerce, über eine Online-Plattform nach Kanada verkauft und sogar auch weiterverkauft in die USA, weil Kanada eignet sich hier auch mitunter als Sprungbrett in den US-amerikanischen Markt. Eine weitere Veranstaltung, die ich nur kurz erwähnen möchte, ist unser Bootcamp, 17. und 18. Juni in Toronto. Was bedeutet Bootcamp? Bootcamp, hier wollen wir vor allem neue Exporteure oder Firmen aus Österreich, die gerade erst vor kurzem auf den Markt gekommen sind. Aber es ist auch interessant für Firmen, die schon länger am Markt sind, für das Management, um eine gewisse Auffrischung zu machen zu Rechtsthemen, Steuerthemen, Marketing, kulturelle Unterschiede. Das erfahren Sie alles hier in diesem Bootcamp, das wir auch sozusagen im Rahmen auch machen kurz vor der Collision, vor der größten Tech-Konferenz in Kanada, die ebenfalls in Toronto stattfinden wird. Damit möchte ich sozusagen diese Webinarserie beschließen. Ich möchte mich bedanken für alle die wirklich vom ersten bis zum letzten Webinar live dabei waren. Falls Sie weitere Fragen haben, gewisse Aspekte nicht abgedeckt sind, hier haben Sie unsere Kontaktdaten. Gerne laden wir Sie auch ein, weil wir eben weitere Webinare machen wollen zum Thema Lebensmittel und Getränke. Wenn Sie hier Ideen haben, wenn hier Punkte vielleicht nicht abgedeckt worden sind, schreiben Sie uns, dann können wir das in unsere zukünftige Webinare einbauen. And once again, I want to switch to English. I want to thank once again our speakers for the very good input. I think the Austrian companies liked it, even if sometimes we didn't have so many companies, but the companies which we represent were very interested, and we see it also after the webinars. We get a lot of requests, and we see it also on the trade volume from Austrian food and drinks coming to Canada. It's moving on. The growth rate is very promising, and thanks to all the speakers, the Austrian companies are now better prepared to come into the Canadian market. Schönen Nachmittag und schönen Abend nach Österreich. Stay tuned. Please keep in touch with us and reach out if you have any further questions. Auf Wiedersehen und goodbye from Toronto. Thank you.